Welcome back to 60 Plus. Let me get this right out of the way and say that I enjoyed completing The Last of Us Part 2. I think the game has done a fantastic job of creating some truly excellent moments, some of which I would rank in the top tier of any media I've ever experienced. What's fascinating to me, though, is that it manages to do this while also making some exceptionally poor and disappointing decisions along the way. It's a game about dichotomy, about highs and lows. It goes from being gripping to being monotonous, engrossing to lifeless. I've not experienced anything like it, and to me, that makes it super interesting. Due to how story-heavy the game is, it's impossible to talk about it in detail without the potential of spoiling certain elements. I understand that not everybody watching this will have finished the main story yet, so depending on your sensitivity, some of the footage shown may be considered spoilery. With that in mind, I've done my best to avoid showing any of the major story beats, and have limited footage to early portions of the game. And because of that, I'll be posting a second video very soon that will be a full spoiler discussion. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at The Last of Us Part 2. First things first, it's clear that The Last of Us Part 2 is a pretty game. In fact, it's one of the best looking games I've ever played and pushes PlayStation 4 hardware to its limits. What the team at Naughty Dog has created is stunning, and a real showcase of what top-of-the-line visuals can be. From the wide landscapes down to the tiniest details, everything has been carefully considered and expertly crafted. The way that water runs off of buildings and snow gets brushed from branches is executed far better than I've ever seen or experienced in a game before. However, through no fault of its own, other than being the victim of unfortunate release timing, the game missed the opportunity to be an absolute showstopper in my mind. That's not to say what's in the game isn't impressive, it certainly is. It's just that it released literally 1 week after the PlayStation 5 reveal event. That meant that next-gen visuals were on the forefront of my mind when playing. It's not a knock against the game, just a bummer that it happened that way. In my initial impressions, I commended the game for having killer audio. From the amazing score, to the vocalizations of the infected, visceral punch of the weapons, and all the natural noises in between, it really is excellent. The vocal performances as well even stood out to me, though not in the way you might expect.
There's the hospital.
The main cast is excellent, there's no two ways about it. They're emotionally charged and exceptionally well delivered.
What?
The supporting cast, though, is where it begins to break down.
You got anything?
Prior to release, it was explained that every enemy NPC, or non-playable character, would be their own person. They'd have their own name, and they'd be able to communicate with each other by name.
Skylar! Go! Get around her!
I'm on it!
Even when separating from what was advertised ahead of time to what's actually in the game, I feel that this aspect falls short of the ambitions they had for it. And this comes down to the fact that in many cases, the same voice actors are used many times over throughout the world.
At least with scars, you know what you're getting. Okay, watch my 6. Think that's her. I'll check it out.
For me, it was extremely immersion-breaking to hear somebody, kill them as part of the mission, and then hear the same voice as they looked for me an hour later.
Ambush! I think it came from back there!
From an actual production standpoint, I totally understand the need to reuse voice talent like that. It's an involved and sometimes lengthy process just to cast a single actor, let alone hundreds. But the results of hearing the same voices over and over was a constant reminder that I was still playing a game, and that this was all make-believe.
Sweep the area for survivors!
Gameplay systems can primarily be broken down into two distinct parts: exploration and encounters. Both halves of the whole were present in the first game as well, but without a doubt, the encounters in The Last of Us Part 2 are far superior to those found in Part 1. Enemy AI presents as far more intelligent. New tools, like Ellie's knife, are given for a wider variety in combat, and the additions of dogs that can sniff out your exact location keep players on their toes. One of my favorite moments in the game, actually, was just after I'd been chased into the subway. While running from a group of soldiers, we collectively encountered a different group of infected. After I drew the infected's attention towards the soldiers, and they started murdering them all, I was able to quietly escape through the other side. It was tense, visually striking, and was an excellent example of fantastic player agency. I'd been trained up to that point, very clearly, that the infected follow noises. I was also clearly shown where they were in relation to the soldiers. By creating noises away from my location, and forcing both groups to run into each other, I was able to predict an outcome and watch it come to fruition. The visuals, audio, and everything else about that scene came together to make it a personal highlight. That being said, while the AI in this game can be really fun and engaging to deal with, there are times where they fall prey to some of my biggest pet peeves. There were numerous times where I'd be spotted or called out with no clear indication of what I'd done wrong. It was like the game didn't like the fact that I was taking my time and wanted to quickly ratchet up the tension. Perhaps there was indeed some place that I'd messed up, or shown myself to the enemies. The logical side of my brain tells me that I must have. But if that's the case, the clarity of that slip-up is what I take issue with. It wasn't made clear to me what I had done wrong, so the way that it felt to me as a player was that the game was cheating, and that's never fun. The other criticism that I have regarding the AI has to do with the pathing or routing that many of the enemies are given. In many cases, enemies walk from A to B to C before returning back to A. They pause at each location just long enough to survey it before moving on to the next one. It feels very robotic and not natural or believable in any way. These are predetermined routes designed for the player to be able to find blind spots in their coverage and exploit it. That kind of gamification of a real-life scenario can be fun, and undeniably was for me in certain instances. The rub, especially in a game like this, that presents itself as a very realistic experience, is that many of the enemies end up just staring at a wall in order to give the player an opportunity. It's immersion shattering. So much work is being done through the narrative to draw the player in and to make them feel like this is a credible world. So for it to be let down by such simple issues is especially disappointing. All of these issues combine to the point that for most of my playtime, I would rarely describe my experience as having had fun. Part of that was thematically intentional and by design, but that's not what I'm talking about here. For me, I began to find frustration in the game when it failed to present clear objectives, primarily a lack of clarity in terms of escape routes while engaged in combat. You see, every encounter in the game follows the same pattern. Either kill every enemy and freely explore with no danger, or sneak past them all to the exit and move on to the next scenario. Killing everything leads to easier exploration, resource collection, and potential side stories, while sneaking frequently felt like a puzzle that needs solving. So often, my engagements started out with the plan to sneak past everyone, but would quickly transform into an all-out brawl once I'd been spotted. The number of times this happened as I ran towards where I presumed the escape to be, only to be met with a dead end though, was incredibly disappointing. Keep in mind, running away is an intended gameplay strategy. Resources are limited to the point that abandoning combat is truly the best decision in certain moments. Failing because the game lacked clarity on where to go next is just frustrating. It's a difficulty spike that only applies to first-time players, and it's something that I think needed smoothing. It checks the box for realism, sure, but that doesn't mean that it was particularly fun. Put another way, on your first playthrough, you lack the knowledge to fully engage with moments. Take for example this garage. The first time I opened the door, I was surprised by the number of infected inside. After dying and coming back to that same area, I now had the knowledge about the encounter ahead of time and was able to approach it completely differently. I set up traps and an escape route before I'd even opened the door. This was that player agency that I was talking about before. I was able to anticipate the future, plan for it, and then execute that plan. I enjoyed this scenario and legitimately had fun completing it. The disappointing part is that I had to die once to gain the knowledge to be able to have that fun. The other side of the coin in terms of gameplay comes in the form of exploration. Wandering the streets of Jackson, the dilapidated city of Seattle, or any of the other environments, there's always a sense that there's something interesting right around the corner. The exploration phase serves three main purposes as far as I can tell. For one, it serves as some much needed downtime in between encounters. Just for pacing purposes, having a breather will always help the flow, because if everything is intense, then nothing is. Next, it serves the practical purpose of restocking resources. Every battle and engagement has the potential to drain your reserves, so stocking up is a crucial part of the gameplay loop. And lastly, it functions as sort of an additional layer of storytelling. The simple way that objects are arranged tell stories just on their own, and is a large contributor to the overall experience. Additionally, conversations between characters give us a greater insight into their relationships. In concept, these sections have the potential to be some of my favorites, since I'm such a sucker for environmental storytelling. In reality, the execution of these moments left much to be desired. For starters, I am absolutely not a fan of the necessity to constantly scavenge. I appreciate that it's a mechanic that is intended to get the player looking into more rooms and environments with a closer attention to detail. What it devolves into, however, is just a game of spot the shiny object and press triangle. It becomes especially annoying in situations where you're positioned close enough to pick up the object, but the camera angle isn't pointed at just the right way to allow you to pick it up. I get that it would encourage too much gunplay and not enough stealth if every fight ended up restocking the full amount of ammo used in that engagement. On the other hand, there are far too many collectibles and partial resources to find, which eventually only serve to draw out the downtime between engagements. If collectibles managed to be individually more meaningful, that could have been another way to combat the fatigue. Guns and holsters are a great example of this, as each one felt like a meaningful upgrade, and that I was uniquely rewarded for my observations. There just weren't enough of them. Even still, the high number of pickups wouldn't be quite so bad if the locations were more worth it to explore from a story sense. The problem is they're not. They stretch believability, they're repetitive, and they go on for far too long. This is further exacerbated due to the fact that the slow-paced gameplay is fully at odds with the story it's trying to tell. The Last of Us Part 2 was not imagined and created because there was a great new gameplay idea that Naughty Dog wanted to experiment with. No. Part 2 was created because there was a story idea that they wanted to explore. To get into that though, as well as why even despite all of my complaints, this is still one of my favorite games ever, we would need to venture into full spoiler territory, and that'll have to wait till next time. I hope you'll stick around for it. You know what to do.